Hello, in today's presentation we are looking at monopolies. Last time we looked at perfect competition, and you're going to see that the demand curve is really quite different because we are dealing with a price setter. So if it's anything other than perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, or monopoly, the firm has at least some degree of control over price, and price varies with output. And so we no longer have a horizontal demand curve. So we will look at this in a moment. And no longer will we have a distinction between what is happening in the industry and the firm. In the case of a monopoly, if it's a pure monopoly, they're the only game in town. They're the only firm producing that particular product. And so the industry and the firm diagrams are the same, one and the same. When we're dealing with monopolistic competition and oligopoly, the products are often differentiated, and so we are dealing with simply the firm and not a combined industry situation, since the products may well be differentiated. So because they are price setters, so again, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly, in order to sell more, the price must decrease as per the law of demand. And so this is what you've seen in the past, a downward sloping demand curve. If you want to sell more, price has to decrease. Now, what students have thought in the past, and adults, all sorts of people, is that a monopoly can charge whatever they want. So if you were up here, over there, you would not be on the market demand curve. And so you wouldn't be able to charge the price and have that quantity that would lie on the demand curve. So it is a falsehood that monopolies can charge whatever they want, because they are constricted by the market demand curve, not the industry demand curve, the market demand curve. All right, so looking at, there is a reason why I'm going to ask you to fill this out. If we wanted to sell more, so the output in units, if it's increasing, the price has to decrease. Let's look at the total revenue, marginal revenue, and average revenue. Marginal revenue is for one more unit. So for one more unit, what does total revenue change by? So let's look at the first few entries, and then I'll ask you to fill out the rest of the table. All right, so for 0 units, we have 0 total revenue, and we don't have a marginal or average revenue. If we are selling now 1 unit, so we've increased the selling to 1, the price is 100, so the total revenue is 100, which is 1 times 100, and the marginal revenue is the change in total revenue, so the revenue from 0 to 100 is 100. And the average revenue is nothing more than total revenue divided by the output, which is the same thing as the price. So there you see the equivalent of the price. So let's look at selling 2 units. So 2 units at now we've had to drop the price in order to sell 2. We have 180 units. So to go from 1 to 2 units, a change in total revenue, which is the marginal revenue, is the difference between 180 and 100, so it's 80. And the average revenue is total revenue divided by price, by output, which is the equivalent of price. And so there it is. And one more row. So price times output would give us total revenue of 240. The difference in the total revenue for selling 1 more unit would be 240 minus 180, which is 60, and the average revenue would be 80. If I can ask you to pause and fill out the rest of the table. When you filled out the table, see what you notice about average revenue, in particularly in comparison to marginal revenue as you go through down the table. And is there something unusual that you notice about marginal revenue? So if you can pause this and fill out the rest of the table. Okay, assuming you filled out the table, and it wasn't just to make you do the math, I think one of the things that is unusual is that marginal revenue does at some point start to become negative. Now, if someone tried to explain to me that marginal revenue actually becomes negative, I'd go, oh, I don't know if I believe you. But if we're looking at the total revenue, because we have this phenomenon as output increases, price has to decrease, we see at some point that we reach a plateau in terms of total revenue, and then total revenue actually starts to decrease. So it does indeed become negative. If we look at average revenue compared to marginal revenue, except at the very beginning, if we look at it everywhere else, we see that average revenue exceeds marginal revenue. So if we were to draw this, it would be at the right. The curve would be to the right of marginal revenue. So we have average revenue exceeds marginal revenue except at the beginning. And what you notice about marginal revenue, that it becomes negative at a certain point. So this will be important when we go to draw the diagrams, and when we go to draw the monopoly diagram. In fact, you will know all the pieces already of what goes into drawing a monopoly diagram. All right, so if we look at marginal revenue and average revenue, and this is non-perfect competition. I just want to remind you, average revenue will be to the right of marginal revenue. Average revenue never becomes negative because it's the total revenue divided by the total units, which would never be a negative number. But we do know that marginal revenue does become negative. So it should be no surprise that it ends up looking like this. So average revenue is to the right of marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is going to cut through the x-axis and actually become negative. So if you could draw those on your printout. All right, this is a diagram I've seen many times in different IB scenarios, different questions and so on and so forth. So I want to first maybe zero in here at the demand curve, which equals the average revenue curve in theory of the firm. And if you cast your mind back to when we looked at price elasticity of demand, if you have a straight line demand curve, smack in the middle, it will be unit elastic, so PD equals 1. As you move further and further up the curve, it becomes more and more elastic, and as you move down the curve, it becomes more and more inelastic. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer, the price being up here. If this is the total revenue curve, you could actually think of this being total revenue as opposed to price. Now, if we look at the formula for PED, so equals percentage change. Sorry, my cursor is not behaving itself. That's supposed to be change, delta triangle, percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. If we move from left to right along the x-axis, we can see that the quantity is increasing. Going up. We know in terms of law of demand that quantity and price move in opposite directions. So if the quantity demanded goes up, then the price must have gone down, meaning that the price is the driving factor. Price decreased and hence quantity demanded increased. If we are dealing with the elastic part of the curve, then we know that when price goes down, quantity demanded is going to go up proportionately more. So if I use my system with 2 arrows, I'll put a second arrow here if we're dealing with the elastic part of the curve. And if I was there in person, I'd say, okay, so price goes down, and I would exaggerate. Price goes down by a bit, but you pick up an awful lot of customers and quantity demanded really goes up. So what happens to total revenue? Total revenue goes up. Once you reach the point of PD being inelastic, we can see that we hit the maximum. Now, if we continue along the demand curve, then, and again, PD equals percentage change demanded over percentage change in price. And again, we know that quantity demanded is going up. So price must have gone down in order to entice people to buy more. If we're on the inelastic portion, again, using my system, the denominator is going to be proportionately greater. So again, if I was standing in front of you, I'd say, boy, we've dropped our price like a whole lot. And I would have my hands way out to show a significant amount. but we've only picked up a few more customers. So what would happen to total revenue? It would decrease. And we know that at the maximum, well, we can see that total revenue, if it's decreasing, then marginal revenue will be negative, which it is here, um, because if marginal revenue is decreasing, then the change in total revenue will be a negative number. So hopefully this diagram makes sense for you. And as I said, I have seen it several times in IB situations. Okay, if I can ask you to pause and read the story on the case study on monopoly and diamonds, please do read it because it does demonstrate a lot of the characteristics of a monopoly. And then please come back and we will continue. So pause your video and then come back and we will continue. Okay, so assuming you've read the case study, you should be able to answer these questions quite readily. And again, please pause if you'd like to capture these questions and their answers. So is a monopoly a price taker or a price maker? Now we knew that in perfect competition they were price takers, but monopolies have an awful lot of power over the market. So they are price makers. The role of advertising, it can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like for instance, if you had a monopoly over nuclear power, you wouldn't necessarily be advertising it. But in the case of De Beers, advertising played quite a large role. Barriers to entry and exit are very high. PD tends to be inelastic. And sometimes, well, often if it's a pure monopoly, there's no product differentiation because they are the only game in town. So again, please pause this if you would like to capture these points. So monopoly, number of firms. So a pure monopoly, only one firm in the market, and that's called, yes, so that is called a pure monopoly. The firm is therefore the entire industry. In the real world, a monopolistic industry may consist of one firm that dominates the market with a very large market share. Barriers to entry are very substantial, at least in the short run. They can be technical, financial, and legal. When we look at a natural monopoly, it can be because of economies of scale. The ownership or control of essential raw materials, as we saw with De Beers, with the diamonds. Patent ownership and research, licenses, copyrights, unfair competition, and branding can play a role. Product differentiation, there's no close substitutes in a pure monopoly. And a monopoly they can emerge because the market can support only one supplier, which is known as a natural monopoly, such as fire protection, railways. I'm thinking of the Postal Service way back when. And a natural monopoly is a single large firm that can produce for the entire market at a lower average total cost than two or more smaller firms. It could be because the firm is the single owner of a raw material, because the firm has bought patent rights, therefore forming a monopoly, or due to government legislation or regulation. Pricing and output. The short run, this is important to remember. The short run now is the same as the long run due to the large barriers to entry. So when we looked at perfect competition, we had a differentiation between short run and long run. Just a reminder, in the long run, you had normal profit only in a perfect competition situation. But because in a monopoly, at least in the short run or medium run or whatever, the barriers to entry are so high that you don't have firms entering and exit like you do in perfect competition. So we're not going to differentiate between the short run and the long run. When maximizing profits, and this is what gets the government and many different stakeholders sort of angry and upset with monopolies, is that the firm tends to restrict output and elevate price. So we can have supernormal profit in this case, unlike perfect competition. We can have supernormal profit in both the short run and the long run. but it may encourage new producers or consumers to seek alternatives or governments to scrutinize the operations. A monopolist may indeed produce greater quantity and accept lower profits to maintain a position or to prevent the government from breathing down their back and having antitrust laws and so on and so forth. A monopolist is a price maker, so the goals can also be other than profit maximization. They can seek to maximize growth and expand output, preserve public goodwill, or product differentiation. Regulation can improve upon the results of a monopoly from the social point of view, and price regulation can reduce price, increase output, and reduce economic profits of monopolies. So a natural monopoly. So remember, it can be where in a way, in plain English, it makes sense to only have one firm dominating the market, and they can have economies of scale so large that it's possible for the single firm alone to supply the entire market at a lower average cost than two or more firms. And also, if we looked at a natural monopoly, if another firm were to enter the industry, the individual firms' demand curve would shift to the left, and in fact, it could be below their long run average cost curve, and so maybe they wouldn't be able to continue to be in business if they can't meet their own costs. So the market might be such that the market really cannot be split between two firms. The demand curve facing the monopolist. Since a pure monopolist is the entire industry, the demand curve it faces is the industry or market demand curve. So remember, so not two different scenarios. We don't have the industry and we don't have the firm. They're one and the same. And again, it's downward sloping. Again, a reminder that the monopolist is a price maker with significant degree of market power. And again, as I said at the beginning, when we looked at the original demand curve, whereas a monopolist has significant degree of control over price, its control is, however, limited by the position of the market demand curve. So as I said, you couldn't just charge whatever you like, because if you don't have the demand for it at that price, you're not going to have the market for your good. And the monopolist cannot choose any price quantity combination that is not on the market demand curve. So monopoly curve, let's actually draw this. So monopoly curve, I'm not going to actually show the demand being fairly inelastic. It would be because there's no refute substitute. And a monopoly will usually show supernormal profit. And remember, short run equals the same as long run. And remember, for profit maximizing, we think of the M&M candies, MC equals MR. So as I'll tell you to do in many of these different diagrams, start off with average cost. So draw the parabola. Now, I don't have a ruler. This is freehand on my tablet. So average cost. Swoop marginal cost through the minimum. Or I'm trying to swoop it through the minimum. It's a little hard with my cursor. So marginal cost. Then draw average revenue. Draw marginal revenue. Okay, so we're going to produce for MC equals MR. So I'm going to switch my color to, let's say, red. So MC equals MR right at this point. So once we've determined where MC equals MR, let's look at that quantity. So there's the Q. That will be our profit maximizing quantity. Now you can forget entirely about MC and MR and concentrate on average revenue and average cost. Let's put this up to average revenue and bring it across. So we know that all of this would be the revenue. Let's look again. We're at this quantity. It meets average cost, which is here. So this was where it meets average revenue. This is where it meets average cost. Let's bring it across. And this would be cost. And so revenue exceeds cost. So here we have the supernormal or abnormal profit. They're the same thing, just different terminology. And there it is drawn for you much more nicely than my freehand. So again, MC equals MR at this point. That forms the quantity. We'll go up to average revenue and bring it across. We'll go up to average cost and bring it across. We see that revenue exceeds cost, and so there's your abnormal or supernormal profit. Okay, a monopoly may wish to produce beyond where MC equals MR. Let's say the government, the people are getting unhappy, they're lobbying the government that this company has too much power. The government says, well, we might bring in antitrust legislation and break you up if you stop sort of restricting quantity and driving up prices. So let's say the monopoly backs down and says, okay, I'm going to produce beyond MC equals MR. So I'm not going to maximize my profit. I'm going to lower the prices, I'm going to increase the cost. Um, and so let's see what would happen. They should still have a supernormal profit because again, they're the only game in town and we're assuming that their profit, excuse me, that their product is still desirable. So let's start with average cost. So there's the formula, average cost. Let's bring marginal cost through the minimum. Marginal cost, let's draw average revenue. And marginal revenue going through the x-axis. So I'll switch colors to blue. We're going to produce where M, oh, I've made a mistake, excuse me. This is MR. Okay, we're going to produce not where MC equals MR. That would be at the profit maximizing position. Let's say we decided to produce over here at Q2. So we're producing more and we're producing at a lower price. I'll show you why in a minute. So let's set average revenue. So if we were producing at the profit maximizing, we would be at this point, if you can see where my cursor is, or the little dot there, we would be producing at a higher price and a smaller quantity. So to get the government off our back or to appease consumers, we're producing more. We've dropped our price, bringing that over. All of that is revenue. Let's see where it intersects average cost. Bring that over. So we still have supernormal profit. It just won't be as much as at the profit maximizing position. But again, since we have monopoly power, there's no reason why we shouldn't still have supernormal profit. All right, let's look at the situation if a monopoly is a revenue maximizing monopolist, and they will produce a level of output with marginal revenue equals 0. And the reason why is that if they stop before that, total revenue would continue to increase. If they were to sell one more unit, it would still be positive. At the maximum, which on our table was 300 units, that would be the maximum total revenue. And then afterwards, total revenue for selling one more unit would start to decrease and marginal revenue would become negative. So some IB questions sometimes ask you to compare and contrast a profit maximizing and a revenue maximizing monopoly. So this is where you would sell if a monopoly were to maximize revenue, where marginal revenue, as the Starbucks burst shows, equals 0. So you continue to sell and your total revenue is decreasing, so that would not be maximizing. If you stop too soon, you'd still be able to increase total revenue and you would be missing out on sales. Now, a firm may want to maximize revenue for several reasons. One, let's say they wanted to embark on a special project and they needed cash and they didn't want to rely on the bank too much. So they need money coming in, not profit, but sales coming in, cash coming in. Let's say they wanted to issue a particularly large dividend, or they were having trouble coming up with the cash to issue a dividend to shareholders. Again, they may want to maximize revenue. There's many reasons why a firm might want to maximize revenue. So Q would be if they were maximizing profits, where MC equals MR, but here, where MR equals 0, is where they would be maximizing revenue. And there it is drawn a little bit more nicely for you. Here's the profit maximizing spot where MC equals MR. Here is the revenue maximizing spot where marginal revenue equals 0. A monopolist need not always make profits, but how is it that a monopolist being a price maker can incur losses? Well, this could happen because the price that monopolists can charge is always constrained by the industry demand curve, as we know. If the costs faced by the monopolist are high relative to demand and price cannot cover ATC, losses will be inevitable. So don't think that they're not capable of incurring losses. And then I think of other things. If you were a monopolist making horse and buggies, there's not much market for that now. If you were a monopolist making VHR tapes, excuse me, or even CD discs, there's not much of a market for that now. So you could once have been a very successful monopoly earning supernormal profits, but if demand also decreases for your product, that could well change your situation. So high barriers to entry prevent potential competitive firms from entering a profit-making industry, and the monopolist can therefore continue to make economic profits indefinitely in the long run. So if your costs for some reason did not become extremely high or higher than where your demand curve is, or if you're not facing a decrease in demand, you could certainly have economic profits or abnormal profits in the long run, or indefinitely in the long run. Allocative and productive efficiency. So this is where the IB is focusing more on, is there market failure? So for allocative efficiency, as we looked at in perfect competition, does price equal marginal cost? And if you look at where a monopolist is maximizing profit, no, price does not equal marginal cost. And also, does price for productive efficiency equal the minimum of average total cost? Again, at the point where you're maximizing profit, no, price is above the minimum of average total cost. And I'll let you read this slide and pause if you like. Aspects of a monopoly. Again, I'm going to let you pause and read this and then rejoin. Fairly self-evident. And once again, pause and rejoin. And here as well, pause. Please read and rejoin. And the same thing, to pause, read it and rejoin. So some disadvantages of monopolies. Well, we know that price tends to be higher, output lower. Do we have allocative efficiency? No. Productive efficiency? No. Lack of competition? Certainly. Some advantages, though. I don't want you to think that a monopoly is always has disadvantages. We can have product development and technical innovation, particularly because they have supernormal profits. They have money to be able to put into product development and technical innovation. And also it can be a way to prevent competitors from entering the market and you no longer holding the monopoly status. There's the possibility of greater efficiency and lower prices due to technological innovations. Again, you can have money to put towards technological innovations, and you can have economies of scale because you're so large in the market, and this can sometimes translate to lower prices. So I'm not asking you to do this assignment, I'm just showing you some questions that could appear in an IB scenario, and I hope that you found this helpful. Thank you.